So hi everyone, welcome to COVID-19 and Organizational Ethnography featuring Bronwyn Frey and Julian Posada. I'm going to begin, I already said I was going to begin recording, which I have done. My name is Wesley Brunson. I go by Wes. I'm the coordinator at the Ethnography Lab, which is hosting today's event. I'm a white man, although I'm still figuring out what my pronouns are. I have long brown curly hair and a beard. I'm wearing a gray stocking cap and an orange shirt and green hooded sweatshirt. I'm at my home in Toronto. Behind me is a gray wall, a medium height fiddle leaf fig tree, a small black shelf, and a line drawing of a human figure. Before I introduce our speakers, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. As I said, today's event is being hosted by the Ethnography Lab. The lab is a student-run participatory space focusing on ethnographic research and methods. Throughout the academic year, we offer workshops, student working groups, speaker series, and ethnographic practica for both graduate and undergraduate students. More information can be found on our website, which I'll put in the chat. And if you'd like to be put on the Ethnography Lab's mailing list, please send me your email as a direct message if you want in the chat, and I'll make sure to add you. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So I'm going to introduce our speakers now and then hand it off to them. Julian Posada is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Information of the University of Toronto and a research fellow at the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. His dissertation, funded by the International Development Research Center, investigates the experiences of workers in Latin America who annotate data for artificial intelligence through digital labor platforms. He collected data for this research during the COVID-19 pandemic using digital ethnography and conducting semi-structured interviews remotely. Bronwyn Frey is a PhD candidate in sociocultural anthropology at the University of Toronto. Her current doctoral research, supported by the Wenner Gren Foundation and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, focuses on app-based food delivery in Berlin. She's interested in how sociopolitical relations at urban and national levels influence the development of courier working conditions, the collection and processing of courier data, and data-driven courier management. She is a member of the University of Toronto's Ethnography Lab and a visiting scholar at the Institute for European Ethnology at Humboldt University of Berlin. So join me in virtually welcoming Julian and Bronwyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Wes, and thanks everyone for joining. I organized this little set of talks because in my own research on app-based careers in Berlin, I've often been struck by how uneven and untransparent managerial processes are in the companies that I focus on. And I've been thinking about the different ways that couriers try to make the company knowable, for example, through sharing information or organizing in various ways. And the ability to know a large international company like the one I'm studying seems especially important in the pandemic when so many lives are at stake. So I thought it would be a generally good thing to share what knowledge I have about ways to know and even influence large companies or other organizations, and to show how helpful ethnography is in this endeavor. So that to that end, I organized this event, and I'm delighted that Julian could also make the time to join me and share his insights on data workers in Latin America. Yeah, so afterwards, please ask us questions about our work or share your own personal or research experiences about organizational responses to COVID-19. Yeah, so now without further ado, I'll hand it over to Julian.
Thank you. Let me just put my slides up. There you go. Can you all see the slides and hear me? Thank you. All right. Thank you very much for having me here today. So my name is Julian Posada, Julian Posada in Spanish, and I am a fourth-year PhD candidate at EFT. I am from Colombia. And this is the results of my experience doing a PhD during the pandemic. Just a bit about my background. I studied the humanities first, but then sociology. So a lot of the methods that I'm using here, of course, social research methods. This is a mixed methods research. I'm going to talk a little bit about everything, but with this, of course, because it's the ethnography lab, I'm going to make more emphasis on ethnography and especially the qualitative methods that I used. But anyway, I'm going to touch a bit about the quantitative data as well, because it was all related. Like I could do, for example, I could find participants for my research thanks to the quantitative data that I used, and I'm going to explain why. So first of all, a little bit of background about my research so you can understand more about like what type of data I collected. So I am, let's say, a critical data scholar and a digital labor scholar. So I study the relationship between human labor and data production, especially for artificial intelligence. And just to put us, to give some context, what is artificial intelligence? It's a so-called intelligence expressed by machines, but actually it's not at all intelligent. So I want to explain quickly. We know we have artificial intelligence in our daily lives. If you go, for example, to YouTube and you see what videos YouTube is recommending to you, if you, for example, don't receive spam mail, so they go to a spam box in your email box, this AI saying, okay, this is spam, this is not spam, and so on. A lot of AI solutions have become ubiquitous in life. And when people talk about AI recently, most of the time they're talking about a subset of it. By the way, AI is a 60-year-old field of inquiry computing. And when people talk about AI today, most of the time they're talking about a specific subfield called machine learning, which is the types of, let's say, quote unquote intelligence. Again, the intelligence is a very broad definition of it, expressed by machines who learn through experience, and this experience is defined by data. And the reason why we talk so much about AI today, especially machine learning, is because we have a ton of data out there. More than 50% of humanity right now has access to the internet. We're constantly producing tons and tons of data, and that data is being fed into machines to learn patterns from the data and to act according to these patterns. Now, this talk is going to be about a particular aspect of machine learning, and it's the human labor that goes into producing the data necessary for machines to learn. And there are three types of human intervention in data sets that I'm going to talk about today, which you can see here in the screen on the left, which are data entry, data annotation, and algorithmic verification. Now, I'm going to give more precise examples in the next slide, but generally, data entry is anything that has to do with generating data for machines. For example, taking a photo, doing a web search, and inputting that data into the model. That's data entry. Then a lot of some of the algorithms that learn through experience, through data, use data that is already labeled by a human. So for machines, an image, like the image that you're seeing right now, the slide that you're seeing in front of you, my voice, everything is expressed in binary code, just ones and zeros stored in some drive. For machines to understand that the bunch of ones and zeros that you're giving to that as an image file is, for example, a house, or that the audio file, a bunch of ones and zeros that represent the audio that you're hearing right now is my voice, and it's a voice, human voice, it needs to be previously labeled, meaning that, for example, if you're giving a house to a machine, you have to tell the machine this bunch of ones and zeros that you're seeing is what we humans call a house. So that's more or less why how machines learn from the representations and patterns of this data. We give meaning to the data. Finally, there is the output. It's statistically impossible for a machine learning algorithm to be 100% accurate. There's always a tiny margin of error, even though it's so tiny that it's sometimes not really meaningful. But in many cases, algorithms can have an output of like 80%, 90%, 98%. There is always that error, and there is always that possibility of improving the accuracy of the model. So that's when humans also, they evaluate the outputs and tell the machine, okay, this is a good or a bad model. And some types of learning, like for example, reinforcement learning, machine learn from those types of, it's called reinforcement because it's by a process of rewards and punishments that the machine learns. For example, an AI that learns how to play Super Mario, by losing the game, the machine knows, okay, I cannot do this again because I'm going to keep losing. And by winning the game, the machine will learn how to perform better. And this is how a lot of AI for gaming occurs right now using reinforcement learning. Now, the image that you have on the right, it's just quickly, raise your hand if you know this, what the image on the right is, just to know if I can. Okay, Bronwyn knows what the image is. I can see the faces, damn. Let's see. Okay, let's just talk about the image on the right quickly. It's what is called the mechanical Turk, or the Turk. It was an automaton that used to be parading in the courts of Europe and in fancy places in Europe in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and it was an automaton that would play a chess and actually be good at playing chess. And people were amazed, thinking like, oh, wow, look at this machine playing chess and beating humans. But the trick was that inside of the automaton, there was a human concealed who was actually the chess player. Now, Jeff Bezos, the CEO, ex-CEO of Amazon, his evil genius prompted him to name the platform, the platform, the place where humans would do the 3 types of work that I just previously mentioned, as Amazon Mechanical Turk, and is I would say the most known platform out there where this type of work is outsourced. And why Mechanical Turk? Because the same principle applies in here. A lot of people think that machines think by themselves, but in reality, there is a lot of human labor, even in the perspective, from the point of view, for example, you as a user creating the data for the machine to learn, human annotators, people verifying them, and all the work that goes behind the AI system, all of that is hidden behind the invisible, behind the machine that you would think thinks on its own, but it's not the case. So that's the idea behind the Mechanical Turk, and it's actually something that characterizes a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today. Now, I just wanted to give some precise examples of these types of tasks that people do to produce data for AI. As I mentioned, data entry, these are data entry, annotation, verification, and impersonation. And these are actually quotes from tasks received by workers that I gathered through my research. I'm going to talk about how later. But for example, data entry, a worker might be asked, you can earn $2.5 by completing the task, do you wear glasses? Upload a picture of a document with your prescription values now. Annotation. Based on the text in each task, select one of these 3 options: sexual explicit, suggestive, non-sexual. And this is to label data for content moderation algorithm that would determine what content would be considered adult or not. Verification, you'll be shown 2 lists of up to 8 search suggestions each. Your task is to indicate which list suggestion is better, and this is for a task to evaluate the outputs of search engine. So imagine you're typing something in your search engine like airports near Ontario, and the search engine here would talk about an airport near Ontario, California. You would say, no, this is an incorrect search. I'm in Ontario, so the probability that I'm talking about Ontario, California, it's very low. So this is just an exaggerated example of how this works. And finally, the impersonation, which is the rarest example that I found, is basically asking people to pretend they're robots. In this task, for example, the requester says, as the assistant, the user will initiate the conversation. So someone uses the chatbot, a human. You, the worker, need to use the facts to answer the user's question by pretending to be a robot. Now, this type of work is outsourced, or it's performed in 3 ways. Usually outsourced through companies on site, platforms, which is the topic of today's talk, and finally other spaces, like for example, nurses who do a lot of data entry when they generate data for healthcare algorithms, AI solutions for healthcare. So now I'm going to talk now about my research. What did I do with this platform? So the problem with platforms, as the example of Mechanical Turk that I mentioned before, is that this population, the workers, are an invisible population. The platforms usually don't want anyone to access the marketplaces, know how many people work for them, who are these people, and so on. So already at the beginning, that was a very tough question. And I, as an early PhD student 4 years ago, I was actually very, I'd say to an extent, afraid of embarking on this research, because I was telling myself, how am I supposed to study an invisible population? Who am I going to talk to if I don't know who these people are? My supervisor told me, just go ahead, let's try to do something. I told him, I know a previous research, the people who have been able to to access this population was through service sent through some of the platforms. For that, you need money. How am I supposed to have money? I'm an international student. I can't apply to Shirk. Please help me. My supervisor was like, the money's not the problem. We'll figure it out. Just go ahead and propose this type of research because it's interesting. You like it. Just go ahead. So I was like, okay, let's go ahead. So how did I find this invisible population? The first question was to find the platforms. And I first searched the literature about what platforms were people talking about. Then also I put myself the hat of I am a worker. So I went to do some online research about like how can I earn money online? And I found some other platforms this way. And also I also put the hat of the I am an AI, like a machine learning developer. I need my data labeled. Where can I go to label my data? And that's how I started like compiling a list of platforms. In the end, I had 93 platforms in the end. The next thing that I did was to actually work for the platforms. I picked up a few of them, around it was 10 of them, the ones that I saw the most common names out there, and I started creating accounts on some of the platforms. I found that some of them were easy to access, actually very easy to access, and started working for them. Others were actually impossible. Like there was this one where I needed a phone number from specific countries, like in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and even asking friends to help me create an account with the phone numbers. I couldn't do it. In the end, it was very impossible for me to, even using VPNs, it was impossible for me to pretend to not live in Canada. So I wasn't able to access this account. In some other cases, I even was working so much for the platform and having such high accuracy rates that they allowed me to access even more, let's say, closed platforms. It's a phenomenon that some scholars from France call deep labor, where you as a worker work for a platform, and when you become accurate enough and with a high reputation, they let you access the big tech companies platform because they have a lot of clients from big tech companies. And then I was able to access these platforms as well. I do work for big tech as well as a worker. So in this early work, let's say ethnographic work, I took also notes of this, and I also I downloaded a lot of instructions that I was receiving as a worker. Now, I was observing these platforms. I was gathering information about how these platforms, how I was working for these platforms. But then I I still had the question: how do I access the population, the other workers out there? So a tip came from a research by a scholar named Florian Schmidt from Germany, and it was in a presentation at a conference before the pandemic, when conferences were in person. And he told us, I noticed that the URL, the website for the workers is always, or in most of the cases, is different from that for the clients. And when I was doing my little list of 93 platforms, I found out that yes, like I as a requester would go to the company website usually under the name of the company, but as a worker, I would have to go to the same company, but another website with a different name, different discourse, different images, everything targeted for workers versus those targeted to clients. And it turns out that Florian Schmidt was saying that web aggregators actually can let you know the web traffic of different websites, but just knowing the different sites. So he used in his research, I'm at Alexa rank, and I used other websites as well just to find the web traffic of these companies. And then there was one of the first ethical questions that I was asking myself: should I pay to access this data? Because a lot of this data is being compiled through, of course, surveillance. If you use Google search, if you use, for example, Google Chrome, you know that your data is being siphoned by this company, then they sell it, transact it through data brokers, and that's how a lot of these web aggregators receive all this data about who accesses which websites and from where and so on. Actually, I recently was writing a chapter when I explained these results, and the ethical paragraph, I explained that because there's no other way to find where the workers are, and this data serves to provide evidence of the north-south divides in this type of work. And also, I'm going to make this data set available for other researchers to do research on. And this is a data set that otherwise would be private for these companies. That's how I decided to keep going and access the data sets and then posted them online. And the results from my own research show that a lot of the workers come from the US, a quarter of them, as you can see. Still 18% of them, the second country is Venezuela, and then countries that are usually associated with business process outsourcing and technology like India, the Philippines, and later on Bangladesh as well, but also Brazil, Russia, Mexico, and so on. And the country that is omnipresent for the requester websites is the United States. So this is an example of how this type of work, there's a north and south divide in this type of work, where most of the clients still come from the United States. Most of the workers, even though a quarter is from the US as well, most of the workers still come from countries in the global south. And by the way, this data does not count for VPN. So that 25% from the US, 24% might be actually lower. A lot of workers were telling me they had to use VPNs, pretend to be in the US so they get paid more for the same tasks just by pretending they're Americans. Now, I knew then that a lot of workers came from Venezuela. And as a Latin American, that was one of the reasons why I wanted to study this population, because I am a Colombian myself. I know the problematic situation in Venezuela right now with the ongoing economic crisis. So I knew that a lot of workers were coming from this country, and no one out there in the academic world was talking about this. So I told myself, I really need to talk about this because no one else is doing it. I guess because no one speaks Spanish in the digital labor community, except for myself. Anyway, the question then was like, how can I access these workers again? Because all these websites, the one from the web traffic was telling me what the platforms were the most used. But then these platforms will not let me access their workers. Another colleague tried and they refused access, and she was like a top researcher in France. They were not giving me access to this. So then what I noticed was that one of the particular platforms that they were accessing was from something that I call worker hubs, like this website called Neobox. As you can see on the right, upper right corner, you can see views, advertisements, mini jobs, surveys, games. It's like a hub where people can find small tasks, like in advertising. Mini jobs is actually the platforms that I'm talking about, service, games, and so on. So that's how I found a way to access this population, through sending a survey that people from these hubs could access, as well as accessing the tasks for the platforms I was studying. So then I sent this survey. I found a company that would send me, let me access several hubs, and I crafted 3 surveys. I'm just gonna go quick about this because it's the quantitative part. 3 surveys. The last one I sent it actually yesterday. And I also use an name generator so I could gather social network data that would exploit in the end. But then I finally found through the survey the population that I wanted to target. And then some ethical questions started to emerge again from this. The first one was the anonymity, not of the workers, because that was a given. Of course, I'm going to anonymize the workers, but about the platforms. Should I anonymize the platforms as well? And I chose yes, because remember that I was getting all those confidential documents from me working for the platform. So as a way to protect myself, I decided to anonymize the 3 platforms that I'm focusing my study on. They don't know, they can't say that I was analyzing their internal documentation by doing this. The second one was the compensation. If I'm going to interview these workers, should I compensate them for their time? And I decided yes, because these are workers who are freelancers. Their time is valuable for them in the sense that they're paid per hour per task, and I'm taking away their time for me to do my research. So I decided to compensate them. I talked to the people at the Ethics Review Board of the University of Toronto, and it was approved that I would pay them, compensate them with the minimum wage of Ontario for their time. And finally, the third major ethical question, this was a big one that actually made me talk to the ethics review department at U of T, was about child labor. Something that I discovered during my research was that because we're in the pandemic, a lot of children are are staying at home. Schools are closed, and because of the direct economic situation, a lot of them are actually working for the platforms. And I talked to the U of T office saying like, hey, I found people telling me that kids are working for this platform. Is that okay? And after a lot of discussion, turns out that child labor exploitation only happens in 3 circumstances, which are when the work hinders the child's physical, mental development. That was not the case. It was like the people from the office were telling me it's like they were teenagers most of the time. Most of the time they were just working a few hours per week. There was me talking to their parents about this because I could not, because of my ethics approval, could not interview them. And basically the people were telling me they don't work many hours per day, and the ethics review board was telling me it's like when you go to a movie theater and there is a teenager working a few hours part-time to make some money for the weekend. So in the end, they were like, this is not considered child labor exploitation. So again, there was another, just to say that it was an ethical question that came up during my research. And now the qualitative work. So I found the population, I found who they were, in which countries, and so on. Now I wanted to how to like contact them one-on-one and to see if they would like to participate for an interview. By the way, I forgot to mention that all of this was happening before the pandemic. I got funding from the IDRC in Canada to do field work in Venezuela, in Colombia actually, and then the pandemic hit. And I was like stuck in Canada. I really need to finish my research, and I decided to conduct the interviews online. So what I found was that many of the workers, the survey, I found that many of the workers are actually on social media, and especially on Facebook, Telegram, and Discord. So I accessed a lot of these worker websites, groups. I contacted the administrators, moderators, and asked them, hey, can I post this call for participants for my research? I'm a PhD student at UFT and so on. And some of them said yes. I posted my call for participants. I received, many people were very interested about my research. And then, although because I mentioned that I was compensated for their time as well. And then I asked them to give me contact email, age, gender, and the names of the platforms they're working for. Why? Because I wanted representation of non-male individuals in my sampling. The age was just to interview people who were more 18 or more, and the platforms just so I knew that I was sure that I was focusing on the platforms that I was studying in the end, and the email just to contact them. Now, the qualitative work, the interviews. I ended up interviewing 33 participants with interviews that lasted between 60 and 180 minutes. I used Zoom. It was like this all the time. I spoke Spanish with the participants, and I asked about their experience with the platforms, their personal networks, and access to welfare and public services, which is three of the crucial, data for me to answer the three crucial questions of my research. And also I used snowball sampling. So this so far was opportunity sampling. I ended up using also snowball sampling by asking them to put me into contact with people they would know. Because again, the personal networks was something that was vital for my research. And that also allowed me to, for example, collect network data on entire families who I didn't know were working for the platforms as well. Then for the data analysis, I used a mix of Excel. I have no shame to say that I use Excel, but also Stata and R to analyze the quantitative data. I used NVivo to code the qualitative data and did two analyses, one for the interviews and the observation, the notes that I had, and all different one for the instructions that I collected by working through the platforms, because I was using dispositive analysis, which is a type of discourse analysis that was different from the thematic analysis that I was using to analyze the data from the interviews and the observation. Now, the part of the instructions, quickly, I ended up joining forces with a colleague from Germany, from the Weizmann Institute called Milagros Micheli, because she was doing research. Remember that I said that there were three types of ways to outsource this work: through BPOs, platforms, and also through professionals, like in healthcare. So she was doing the BPO work in Argentina. I was working on the platforms, mainly from the Venezuelan perspective. So we joined forces and we analyzed the instructions for a paper about the discourse embedded in these instructions and therefore in datasets. And also there was, through her and other colleagues, we also did a series of workshops. This is the human-computer interaction side of my research. I love different from like the sociological and like classic social science side of it. Basically, we had workshops with workers, requesters, and managers of BPOs to try to craft a framework to document data sets, because so far you can, like, as a person who develops AI, you receive a data set, you don't know who labeled it, in which conditions, and then you sell that model to someone else and no one knows where the data came from. So there is a lot of push right now in computer science for documenting the origins of data sets, and of course a lot of that does not take into consideration the quality of work for workers. So we wanted to create propose a new type of co-designing documentation framework that includes workers and their experiences as well. And finally, the findings, more stories. So all of that data, I ended up writing 4 main findings chapter for my dissertation. I just finished, I finished the first version of the 3rd chapter, and I'm hopefully, I really want to finish the dissertation by at least January or February, the first draft, because I need to graduate this year. But just to summarize my findings, the first one, as you can see here, inequalities in data work. I use most of the quantitative data here, and this chapter is about the inequalities in platform data work from the North-South divide, like most of the clients are in the US, most of the workers are in the global South, but also about the differences in the working conditions. The second one, this is a sociological chapter, I would say. The second one is also very sociological. I use the social network analysis in the interviews here, and it's about the networks of support that go to support workers when they don't have the support of employers because they're considered freelancers, but also in the case of Venezuela, the state is not present anymore to provide like healthcare or other types of welfare. So it's the networks who step up and provide support for workers. So this is the second chapter. Now the third one is more like media and communications, I would say, or humanities, in the sense that this is the one I use the interviews and observations, but it's mainly about the discourses in data production with algorithms. And it's a chapter based on a paper that I co-wrote with Mila Michele. And then finally, the last chapter is more the computer science one, the more like human-computer interaction one. And it's data from the co-design workshops, and it's about this co-design framework for to co-design data set documentation that we did. So this is basically the overview of the findings of my dissertation. Again, I mean, the Faculty of Information, so that's why it's so like sociology here, media and communications there, and computer science there, because it's for the PhD in information science. And that's it. That was my journey to collect my data and to write this dissertation that I'm doing currently. And thank you very much for your time.
Cool, thanks so much. Yeah, do people want to take a 5-minute break, or should we just power through? If we don't take a break now, then we would definitely take a break after my presentation, I think. After my presentation? Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so I'm Bronwyn Frey. As Wes said, yeah, I'm a PhD, fifth-year PhD candidate in social cultural anthropology. My pronouns are she. I have mid-length brown hair with bangs and glasses. And yeah, I'm a white woman, and my background is blurred. So let me just share my screen. Okay, so I think everyone can see that? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, so my research is on a company that I'm calling Fleets. That's in Germany. It was founded in Berlin in the late 2000s. And it's an app-based food delivery company, so similar to Uber Eats or DoorDash in Canada. So during my field work in 2019 to 2020, Fleets employed about 4,000 couriers, who are also called riders or drivers, across 40 cities in Germany. And about 1,000 of these worked in Berlin. So Fleets riders could make deliveries using their own vehicle. If they worked in one of the, they could make deliveries using their own vehicle, which was often a bike, but could be like a car or a scooter. Or if they worked in one of the 22 cities with a hub, then they could use one of the company's e-bikes. So the hubs were these large warehouses full of bikes, helmets, delivery backpacks, as well as offices for hub supervisors called hub coordinators, and facilities for rider onboarding sessions. So the e-bike riders began and ended their shifts at the hub, which in Berlin was located quite centrally, and riders with their own vehicles would start at designated points around the city. So riders would begin their assigned shifts by opening up the Fleet's courier app called Racer and pressing a play button in the top left corner. And they were automatically assigned orders based on their proximity to restaurants. And they could have anywhere from 1 to 3 orders in their job list at a time. And the app had also a Google Maps plugin that would show couriers the routes between restaurants and customers. And so because of Germany's relatively strict labor laws, it's illegal for platform workers like Fleet's couriers to work as freelancers, like they do in the vast majority of platform companies worldwide. So yes, so again, going back to Uber Eats and DoorDash in Canada, all of these workers are so-called gig workers, and their income is just based on a commission that they get per order. And this is illegal in Germany. It's called Scheinselbstständigkeit, or false self-employment, when you're a gig worker, but you're only working for one company. So this means that instead of earning just a per delivery commission, the riders were employees with a guaranteed minimum wage of 10 euros per hour, contracts, and statutory benefits. So I was employed as a Fleets rider from November 2019 to March 2020 on a so-called mini job contract of 5 to 10 hours a week. There were also student contracts of 12 to 20 hours a week, midi job contracts of 12 to 39 hours, and so-called part-time contracts of 30 to 48 hours per week. And I was a hub rider, so I signed out a backpack and an e-bike at the beginning of every shift at the hub. Most of the other hub riders were South Asian, usually Indian men, in their 20s, doing graduate degrees in management or engineering. And a smaller but still distinct group of hub riders were Argentines with 1-year working holiday visas. And I also met hub riders from Australia, Venezuela, Syria, Germany, although Germans were usually better represented among the couriers with their own bicycles. And I conducted 15 semi-structured interviews with riders, in addition to taking field notes on my interactions with about 30 of them on a regular basis. I also conducted a number of interviews with managers and employees in Fleets' logistics department. So this was distinct from their software development department, which I tried and failed to gain access to. But I did conduct interviews with the chief logistics officer and his managers in driver recruitment, HR, works council management, local operations, and dispatching. And I also spent several hours talking to dispatchers and their supervisors in the office. So like many governments, businesses, and institutions, Fleets scrambled to roll out safety measures when the pandemic hit. So on February 28th, 2020, they sent riders the first email about COVID, advising them to seek medical attention if they were symptomatic, and or if they had recently been in China, Iran, Italy, or South Korea. The email also said to continue to work their scheduled shifts, but to keep a close eye on updates from dispatchers, to cover coughs and sneezes, and to avoid symptomatic individuals. And for now, the email concluded, face masks are not recommended since they don't really minimize against the risk of infection. On March 13th, they implemented a process for contactless delivery. On March 17th, they allowed riders to use up their allotment of paid and unpaid sick days and holidays without having to provide a sick note from a doctor and without any disadvantage on their performance record. On March 20th, they issued riders electronic certificates stating their permission to work in case of a lockdown. The next day, they closed the hub as an equipment depot. Riders now had to use their own bikes or borrow one from the company's fleet of non-electric bikes, normally reserved for e-bike shortages. On March 23, the company had secured limited amounts of hand sanitizer for riders. On April 8, they told riders that their doctors had determined that the alcohol content of the sanitizer was too low to kill viruses. Therefore, and also because of supply chain issues, they announced that they would pay riders a lump monthly sum based on the amount of shifts worked and the market price of sanitizer, gloves, and masks. the latter of which were now officially recognized as limiting the spread of COVID to offset the costs of riders buying their own PPE until the end of May. Also at the beginning of April, the company implemented a compensation program for riders using their own bike. And in Germany, workers are actually entitled by law to be fairly compensated for using their own tools at work. But so far, riders had to fight almost all delivery companies in Germany to get this. The reason for Fleet's suddenly improving working conditions in this way was because the company needed a lot of riders, as a hub coordinator told Patrick, a rider from Nigeria. Riders were leaving either because they felt unsafe or were because it's a largely migrant workforce returning to their original country. This new compensation was 10 cents per kilometer, up to 44 euros a month, in the form of an Amazon voucher. And this was the most that the company could legally give the riders without the riders having to pay tax on it. In addition, this compensation was temporary. At first, it was planned until the end of May 2020. The company then continued to extend it by a few months at a time. And then finally, just this month, monetary compensation for riders' use of their own bikes and phones was made permanent by the Federal Labor Court after the Rider Works Council and the Food Service Workers Union took Fleets to court. Finally, Fleets quickly began working on a new online tipping feature, which they hadn't had before. So previously, customers could only tip riders in cash. And online tipping was seen as important in reducing physical contact that could spread the virus. And by the end of May 2020, the tipping feature had been rolled out. It was developed in a hurry, so it's not surprising that there were issues. The main problems for riders were that they couldn't see how much they had earned in tips. And even more seriously, the tips weren't showing up on their paychecks. These issues were eventually fixed over the course of a few months. And another issue actually for riders at the beginning of the pandemic was bathroom use. So normally riders could use restaurant or public bathrooms during their shifts, but public bathrooms were locked and restaurants were in lockdown and also concerned about their safety. Fleets had asked restaurants to let riders use their facilities, and they had asked riders to report restaurants that refused, but in the end, the company couldn't force the restaurants on the issue. So as a result, riders usually resorted to using public parks. So riders themselves had a variety of responses to Fleet's responses to the pandemic. So when I spoke to Ranveer, a 23-year-old master's student in industrial engineering in early April, he had already been back home in Indore, India for a few weeks. He thought that Fleets wasn't doing enough to protect the riders. It's, quote, the most risky job, he said. People just shouldn't be working at all. If they continue operations, it will be against the drivers. Shivansh, 24, was Ranveer's classmate in the industrial engineering program. He also went back home, which for him was Pune, when COVID broke out. He had actually ended his contract in the middle of March so that he could find work more closely related to his studies. On March 13th, the day he was leaving for India, he got a call from a hub coordinator saying that he hadn't provided his ability for the coming week, and also asked if Shivansh could actually come in today too. Shivansh was afraid to go to work, but the hub coordinator tried to pressure him into coming in. And Shivansh said they, quote, kept aside, end quote, the fact that riders are the most vulnerable. But later they realized it's not correct to pressure the riders. They started sending emails saying that if you don't want to work, to use your vacation days. Many of the riders who stayed were less critical of Fleets' pandemic response. So Rachit, a 25-year-old master's student in healthcare management, had, quote, not much to say, end quote, about Fleets' COVID safety measures. They're still operating, but they are taking precautions very seriously, he said, sort of non-committally. Jeremy, a 39-year-old punk from the United States, thought that fleets had a light response to the coronavirus, but he was also not particularly worried about his health. He thought that riders should be fine, quote, as long as you keep social distance, wash hands, don't touch your face. It's not like Chernobyl, end quote. Patrick, a 28-year-old rider from Nigeria doing his master's in cartography, thought that fleets' responses to the pandemic was, quote, good because they gave riders masks and sanitizer and had online information sessions, also contactless delivery and higher bonuses. Jose, 36, was a long-term rider from Venezuela who lived in a town outside Berlin with his wife and never had anything bad to say about fleets. And he wasn't worried about getting sick. He washed his hands, he wore a mask on public transit, he kept the recommended distance of 1.5 to 2 meters from people, but he said, quote, I read a lot, and after you read a lot, you can't decide what information is true. On the one side, doctors say it's dangerous and it's necessary to do social distancing because the virus might be more than the regular flu. On the other hand, he had been reading some other information from doctors who are, quote, scientists possibly, who say it's not that dangerous, that they are just changing the name of the regular flu season. The test that they do could be positive randomly or as an error, so the numbers are not really accurate. And then there was also a group of riders who stayed but were highly critical of fleets in many aspects, including the company's pandemic response. And these were the riders at the Free Workers Union or the Freie Arbeiterinnenunion, or FAU in German. And this is an anarchist union that has generally led the political organization of riders across many different app-based delivery companies in Berlin. So after a lull in their political activity, they reformed a working group for riders in May 2020. And the new initiative seemed to be inspired by pandemic-related issues. And there was a sense that now is a good time to capitalize on riders' frustration. There was the new online tipping tool, for example. So riders weren't sure if it was tax-free. And as I said, there had been problems with riders knowing how much they had earned in tips and even getting that amount transferred to their paychecks. Another issue was the compensation for the own bike use. So full-time riders often spent more than the limit of 44 euros per month on parts and repairs and found it impractical or, depending on their political orientation, unethical to shop for bike parts on Amazon. And many thought that it was unfair that the only kilometers that fleets seemed to count towards this compensation were those between the restaurant and the customer. So the customer to restaurant, from home to the first order, and from the last order to home were not counted. Fleets claimed it counted the kilometers from customer to restaurant, but riders doing their own calculations with apps like Garmin or Strava or even Google Maps agreed that this was not the case. So in earlier years in Berlin, with another app-based food company that I'll call Dinnery, FAU, the anarchist union, had demanded an own bike compensation and had staged a protest in front of Dinnery's offices in Berlin. They had collected broken old bikes and parts to throw in front of the doors of the office to show the company that this is what they had to work with. But when the protesters arrived, a Dinnery manager came outside and told them that they would be introducing a per kilometer compensation that could be redeemed at a particular bike store. And this was, in fact, soon implemented. And as an anarchist union skeptical of state strictures and staid bureaucracy, FAU has few qualms about organizing wildcat strikes and other colorful demonstrations. And this is one of the reasons that they are good at attracting media attention. So last winter, when Berlin got an unusually heavy amount of snow, FAU helped organize a small strike to protest the dangerous working conditions, which was picked up by Taz, a well-known leftist newspaper, and fleets, perhaps because of the protest, did in fact close their operations for a day or two. The extent to which journalism and social media influenced managerial decisions is not, however, entirely clear to me. But the managers were certainly aware of the media. I spoke with one manager, Klaus, in November 2020, just after a rider had died on the job. And he was really upset about the death. And he also resented reading, quote, "a lot of bullshit on Twitter that we are so dumb and stupid people at fleets and not working for the driver," end quote. Especially because he was currently working on a rider retention program that he thought had, quote, "a lot of good ideas and even things we're going to see in the future," end quote. And when I met with Roman, the head of dispatching, one of the first things he said to me was that the algorithm doesn't discriminate against riders based on their performance, i.e. by giving more orders to faster riders. Quote, "This topic is in the press a lot," he said, "but the algorithm just looks at where the riders are in relation to restaurants and customers." And on April 5th in 2020, an online news outlet called Bento published a story about riders' hardships during the pandemic. And it was subsequently picked up by Der Spiegel, which is a widely read German newspaper. And the opening anecdote described a rider who goes shopping for hand sanitizer before his shifts, because for weeks he's been waiting for fleets to provide it. In response to the flood of information emails about COVID fleets had sent its riders in recent months, another rider mockingly commented, quote, "Everyone knows how to wash your hands properly by now, but emails alone do not protect," end quote. So on April 8th, 3 days after this article was published, was when fleets sent out that email to riders saying that they would provide the monthly lump sum to cover the costs of buying sanitizer and PPE until the supply chain caught up with demand. And this article, as well as others about riders' pandemic hardships that appeared in mainstream newspapers like Zeit and Tagesspiegel that appeared in the following months, cited a riders' rights campaign originating in Cologne and backed by NGG, the Food and Catering Union. The head of this campaign was also invited to a conference on the platform economy hosted by the Berlin Senate Department for Integration, Labor and Social Affairs. The NGG was also behind the court case I mentioned, by which fleets is now obligated to compensate riders for using their own smartphones and bikes on the job. Also connected to the NGG were the works councils or Betriebsräte. So German law states that workers represented by an elected works council have the right to co-determine their working conditions with the employer. So while trade unions reserve the right to strike and negotiate pay, works councils otherwise have significant control over workplace conditions, including hiring and firing. Through regular meetings with management, they have the right to know about the company's financial situation and business strategy. And from the moment they announce their first election, works council members are protected from employer retaliation. And this is where often the unions become essential because they offer training in how to elect the first works council without making any legal missteps that could result in an invalid election or in termination. And so once elected, works council members receive their usual pay to conduct works council business during their usual working hours. Works council members at fleets were usually German and had worked as app-based couriers for several years. So they weren't, and so like most of the fleet is international students or people on working holiday, not Germans. So the works council is, yeah, so it's sort of this division in the labor force that way. And so these works councils were elected in Cologne, Hamburg, Bremen, Kiel, Frankfurt, Stuttgart, Nuremberg, and Münster. And then there is also a general works council that oversees and coordinates co-determination rights for all of Germany. So sometimes works councils can be taken over by management-friendly leaders, or once militant works council campaigners can become complacent once a works council is established. But this was not the case with fleets. So the riders' works councils had extremely low trust in the management and fought them on almost everything. They also, by means of co-determination, had a considerable amount of insight into and influence on managerial processes. They had been very involved in the implementation of the own bike compensation, for example. And this is how Césaire, the chairman of the General Works Council, narrated the process to me. So I'm paraphrasing, but the Works Council did their legal research and discovered that if a company fails to compensate workers for using their own tools, this counts against any wages that the company pays out. And because riders make minimum wage or just above, this meant that Fleets was not even paying minimum wage if riders were using their own bikes and smartphones. The Works Council presented this to Fleet's management, and the Works Council said that they would continue to report the illegal wages to the German Labor Board every month, which results in a 25,000 euro fine each time. So this discussion happened in 2019, and the Works Council and the management proceeded to negotiate over an own bike compensation for the next 2 years. The management's first objection, of which Césaire, the chairman, was skeptical, was that the company had a problem with its accounting software, and this prevented them from being able to transfer the compensation directly into riders' bank accounts. Second, that 44 euros was the most that a company can give an employee without being taxed. When the pandemic hit and Fleets needed to stem the exodus of couriers, the Works Council agreed to management's proposal for a temporary compensation program with the Amazon vouchers until a permanent solution was found. And as I mentioned, the permanent solution seems to be this month's ruling that Fleets has to compensate riders for using their own bikes and smartphones. So to sum up, Fleece's response to the COVID-19 pandemic was rushed and uneven, like that of many businesses or large organizations, especially in the first 6 months of the pandemic. Fleece's response was characterized by a lot of emails, and some of their main interventions were contactless delivery, the unconditional use of paid and unpaid sick days and holidays, a provision of PPE and hand sanitizer, closing the hub, and canceling the distribution of e-bikes, a new but limited compensation for own bike use, and a new online tipping feature. Some riders left the company because they found Fleece's response or even the idea of doing courier work under any conditions in the pandemic unacceptable. Others stayed because they wanted to or they couldn't afford not to. The challenges faced by these riders included problems with the tipping feature, the delayed provision of PPE, no access to hand washing facilities or toilets, and frustration about the inadequacy of the own bike compensation. Riders could try to understand Fleets' managerial processes through official channels like emails or less formal chats with hub coordinators. Those who were in the Works Council or who reached out to them could gain additional insights. And the Works Council's understanding of the company was, however, marked by much mistrust, even though communication was supposed to be transparent under the aegis of co-determination. And finally, riders had a number of levers for dealing with varying degrees of clout in influencing management's decisions and processes. So the company seems to be at least a little sensitive to their image in the media. Additionally, some forms of direct action and wildcat strikes led by FAO may have had some impact. The Works Council and the Food and Catering Union have considerable legal power in advocating for better working conditions, but it seems to be a struggle to get Fleets to honor even some basic rights, like compensation for the use of one's own tools at work. And overall, my impression is that Germany has a relatively worker-friendly legal framework, but this does not determine how management and riders will end up using this framework and what the results will be. I also just wanted to reiterate what's written in the event description, which is that these insights would be hard to come by without ethnography. I did, and you can get some very detailed descriptions from longer pieces from journalists, especially leftist or labor-oriented journalists. But having everyday conversations and chats, even if a lot of them are online these days, gives a much better sense of the people who are involved. You can also encounter a wider range of interlocutors, not just the outspoken and justifiably angry riders who want to speak to journalists, but also those who don't think too much about the job because they just see it as a temporary phase, or those who feel deeply grateful to have this job and would never say anything to a researcher that might endanger their position. You can also get a sense of the nuances of riders' interactions with the company. And I think it's important that rider organizers and activists and newspapers are scandalizing the working conditions of riders, especially in the pandemic. And I also think that an ethnographic approach is important, especially one that involves people from the managerial side, if possible, because it makes it harder to demonize them. And what I've come to see more clearly over the course of this project is that while some managers, dispatchers, or hub coordinators can act unethically or rudely, many are often thoughtful and not okay with seeing riders struggle. But it's the imperatives of running a competitive business that compel them to think primarily in terms of efficiency and profits. And to conclude on an especially political note, this shows how capitalism is a fundamentally antisocial system. So yeah, thank you.